The house wasn't just alive, it was waiting. The whispers grew louder, wrapping around Ifeoma like a noose as she clutched the glowing key. She had thought she could escape, but now she realized the truth. The house wasn't holding her captive out of chance. It had chosen her. The darkness was suffocating. Ifeoma couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed. The hidden room, with its eerie blue light and chilling whispers, was gone. Now there was only silence, a silence so deep it pressed against her ears like a living thing. She tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, as though invisible hands were holding her down. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Where was she? How had she gotten here? The last thing she remembered was the room shaking, the shadows closing in, and the sound of that cold, unforgiving voice. Ifeoma. Her name echoed in the darkness, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. It wasn't the voice from before. This voice was familiar, almost comforting. It sounded like her mother. Ifeoma, wake up! Her body jerked violently, as if jolted by an electric shock. She opened her eyes and found herself lying on the cold, wooden floor of the White House's hallway. The hidden room was gone, replaced by a long, dimly lit corridor that stretched endlessly in both directions. Wake up, the voice shouted again, but this time it wasn't coming from her mind. It was coming from behind her. She turned, her heart pounding, and froze. The figure from the window stood at the end of the hallway, its silhouette tall and unmoving, its head tilted slightly, as though studying her. In the dim light, Ifeoma could see its face, or rather, the absence of one. Where its eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was only smooth, featureless skin. The figure raised an arm, its long fingers curling into a beckoning gesture. Come. Ifeoma scrambled to her feet, shaking her head. No, I'm not coming with you. The figure didn't move, but its voice filled the hallway, low and guttural. You opened the door. You took the key. Now you are part of this house. The walls around her began to groan, the sound of wood splintering and nails creaking echoing through the corridor. The floorboards beneath her feet started to shift, as though the house itself were alive. Ifeoma didn't wait to see what would happen next. She turned and ran. The hallway seemed endless. No matter how far Ifeoma ran, the walls remained the same, lined with those horrifying portraits of screaming faces. The air grew colder with each step, and the whispers returned louder now, overlapping one another in a cacophony of voices. Don't leave. Help us. You belong here. Ifeoma clamped her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. The whispers were inside her head, clawing at her sanity. Her legs burned with exhaustion, but she forced herself to keep going. Finally, she saw something ahead, a door. It was different from the others, larger, with intricate carvings that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. She reached out and grabbed the handle, her hand trembling as she turned it. The door swung open and she stumbled inside. The room was massive, its ceiling so high it disappeared into shadow. A grand chandelier hung above, its crystal pieces cracked and covered in cobwebs. The walls were lined with shelves, each filled with jars containing what looked like shadows. They shifted and writhed as though alive, pressing against the glass as if desperate to escape. In the center of the room stood a tall, ornate mirror. Its surface was black, reflecting nothing but darkness. As Ifeoma approached, the whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a storm. She hesitated, staring at the mirror. Something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just a mirror, it was a doorway, a portal to something she couldn't comprehend. A shadow moved behind her. Ifeoma spun around, but the room was empty. Her reflection in the mirror, however, remained turned away from her. It began to move on its own, raising a hand to point at one of the shelves. "No," Ifeoma whispered, stepping back. "This isn't real." Her reflection didn't respond. It simply pointed, its expression eerily calm. Against her better judgment, Ifeoma turned to look at the shelf her reflection was indicating. On it was a single jar, larger than the others. Inside was a shadow unlike any she'd seen before, twisted, malformed, and radiating a palpable sense of dread. The label on the jar read, "Ifeoma." Her breath hitched. What is this?" The shadow inside the jar slammed itself against the glass, causing the entire shelf to rattle. The whispers turned into screams, and the chandelier above began to sway violently. Ifeoma grabbed the jar, desperate to stop the noise, but the moment her fingers touched it, the glass shattered. The shadow surged out, wrapping itself around her like a suffocating blanket. Her vision blurred, and she felt herself being pulled into the darkness once more. When she woke, Ifeoma was no longer in the house. She was standing in the middle of a market, surrounded by the sounds of Lagos life. Hawkers shouted their wares, women bargained for fresh produce, and children weaved through the crowd. It was so vivid, so real, that for a moment, she thought she'd escaped. But something was wrong. The people weren't looking at her. In fact, they weren't looking at anything. Their faces were blank, their eyes empty, as though they were mere puppets going through the motions of life. "Ifeoma." The voice was back, but this time it wasn't cold or menacing. It was soft, sorrowful. She turned to see a young girl standing a few feet away. The girl looked familiar, with wide, curious eyes and a shy smile. "Who are you?" Ifeoma asked, her voice trembling. The girl didn't answer. She simply held out a hand. Reluctantly, Ifeoma took it, and the market around her dissolved into darkness. When the world reformed, they were standing in front of the White House. But it wasn't the same. The walls were cracked and weathered, the gates rusted and hanging off their hinges. The windows were shattered, and the garden was overgrown with weeds. "This is where it began," the girl said softly. "What do you mean?" Ifeoma asked. "What began here?" "The house wasn't always like this," the girl continued. "It was a home once, a happy home. But something happened, something terrible." The ground beneath them trembled, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. The girl tightened her grip on Ifeoma's hand. "You have to stop it," she said. "You're the only one who can." "I don't understand," Ifeoma cried. "Stop what? What am I supposed to do?" Before the girl could answer, the world around them shattered like glass, and Ifeoma was pulled back into the house. She landed hard on the wooden floor of the hallway, gasping for air. The house was alive now, its walls pulsing like a beating heart. The figure from before stood at the end of the hallway, its featureless face twisted into a grotesque grin. "You cannot leave," it said, its voice echoing like thunder. "You belong to the house now." "No," Ifeoma shouted, clutching the key in her hand. "I don't belong here." The figure lunged at her, moving impossibly fast. Ifeoma ducked, rolling to the side as it slammed into the wall, splintering the wood. She scrambled to her feet and ran, clutching the key tightly. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, but Ifeoma kept running. She could feel the figure chasing her, its heavy footsteps echoing behind her. The whispers grew louder, urging her forward. Finally, she saw it, a door at the end of the hallway, glowing with the same faint blue light as the key. She reached it just as the figure's hand brushed her shoulder. She shoved the key into the lock and turned it. The door flew open and blinding light engulfed her. The blinding light enveloped Ifeoma, and for a moment, she thought she was free. But as the light faded, she realized she was still in the house. Only this time, she wasn't alone. She was in a circular room, its walls lined with mirrors that reflected not just her image, but endless variations of herself. Some old, some young, some twisted and grotesque. The air was thick with tension, and the whispers were louder than ever, a relentless storm of voices pressing in from all sides. In the center of the room stood the faceless figure, its body shifting and rippling like a shadow barely held together. It raised a hand, and the mirrors began to shimmer. One by one, the reflections stepped out, becoming solid. They surrounded Ifeoma, their distorted faces filled with malice. "You cannot escape," the figure said, its voice a blend of countless tones. "You are part of this house. You always have been." Ifeoma clenched the key in her hand, her knuckles white with fear. "Why me? What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, as if amused. "You don't understand? This house feeds on those who wander too close. It traps them, breaks them, and turns them into echoes, just as you will become." The distorted reflections began to close in, their hollow eyes locked on Ifeoma. She backed away, her mind racing. The key in her hand glowed faintly, and she felt a strange warmth emanating from it. Somehow, she knew it was important, her only chance at survival. "No," she whispered. "I won't let you take me." The warmth from the key spread through her body, and suddenly, the room began to change. The mirrors cracked, their surfaces rippling like water. The reflections faltered, their forms flickering like weak flames. The faceless figure let out a low growl. "You cannot defy the house." But Ifeoma wasn't listening. She focused on the warmth, letting it guide her. Images flashed through her mind, glimpses of the house's past, of the people it had consumed. She saw the young girl who had guided her earlier, standing with her family in the garden, their faces filled with joy. She saw the moment it all changed, a strange man entering the house, carrying a black book etched with symbols. She saw him performing a ritual, summoning something dark and ancient that twisted the house into what it was now. The house wasn't alive by chance. It had been cursed. The images faded, and Ifeoma was back in the room. The faceless figure loomed closer, its form towering over her. The reflections lunged, but Ifeoma dodged, gripping the key tightly. She realized then that the key wasn't just a tool. It was a weapon. With a cry, she plunged the key into the nearest reflection. It let out a piercing scream, shattering into 1,000 shards of light. The other reflections hesitated, as if unsure what to do. The figure roared, "You cannot destroy us. We are eternal." "Not anymore," Ifeoma said, her voice shaking but resolute. She turned and ran toward the largest mirror in the room, the one directly behind the figure. It was different from the others, its surface swirling with darkness. She knew instinctively that this mirror was the heart of the house, the source of its power. The figure lunged at her, its shadowy form stretching across the room. Ifeoma ducked, feeling its claws swipe inches from her back. She reached the mirror and raised the key, its glow intensifying. "This ends now," she screamed, driving the key into the heart of the mirror. The effect was immediate. The mirror exploded in a burst of blinding light, and the figure let out an ear-splitting shriek. The walls of the room trembled, and the reflections dissolved into nothingness. The house itself began to collapse, its structure groaning as though in pain. Ifeoma stumbled out of the circular room, the ground shaking beneath her feet. The hallway stretched out before her, but now it was filled with cracks and collapsing debris. The whispers had turned into screams, a cacophony of rage and despair. She ran as fast as she could, dodging falling beams and splintering wood. The air was thick with dust, and her lungs burned with every breath. The key in her hand continued to glow, guiding her toward the front door. The faceless figure appeared one last time, blocking her path. Its form was unstable, flickering like a dying flame. "You cannot leave," it roared. "You are part of us now." Ifeoma didn't stop. She clutched the key and charged forward, her fear replaced by determination. The figure reached for her, but as she passed through it, its form disintegrated into ash. She burst through the front door just as the house collapsed behind her, its walls folding in on themselves like paper. She fell to her knees on the lawn, coughing and gasping for air. When she looked back, the house was gone. In its place was an empty lot overgrown with weeds. The key in her hand had turned to dust, scattering in the breeze. The street was quiet as Ifeoma stood, her legs trembling. The neighbors' homes were intact, their lights flickering as though nothing had happened. But Ifeoma knew better. The house was gone, but its echoes would remain. She returned to her apartment, her body aching and her mind racing. Sleep was impossible that night, her dreams filled with images of the faceless figure and the cursed mirror. But when she woke, the whispers were gone. For the first time in weeks, she felt free. Madame Fawzat visited her the next day, her sharp eyes filled with both relief and curiosity. "The house, it's gone, isn't it?" she asked. Ifeoma nodded. "It's gone. For good." Madame Fawzat placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're brave, my dear. Many have tried to escape that house, but none have succeeded. You've done something remarkable." But Ifeoma didn't feel remarkable. She felt tired, drained, and haunted by what she'd seen. She didn't know if she'd ever truly escape the memories of the house, but she was alive, and that was enough. Months passed, and life on Alimo Street returned to normal. Ifeoma moved out of the neighborhood, determined to leave the past behind. But one day, as Madame Fawzat swept the pavement outside her shop, she noticed something strange. The empty lot where the house had stood was no longer empty. In its place was a small, white bungalow, its walls pristine and its windows gleaming. And at the upstairs window, a shadowy figure stood, watching.